Hello everyone, Mr. Linder here. Let's talk about other important endocrine glands like the parathyroid glands, the pancreas, the pineal gland, and the thymus gland. So an important ion that we need to regulate in the human body is calcium. And calcium balance is very important because we use calcium for our bones and for our teeth. We use calcium in the nervous system to release neurotransmitters. We use calcium for muscle contraction. Calcium is used in blood clotting. It's used in tight junctions. And so it has a variety of functions within the human body. So being able to regulate that balance is vitally important. So the parathyroid glands are four tiny glands, usually four, that are embedded on the posterior aspect of the thyroid gland. So in this diagram, you can see the location of the parathyroid glands. Here they're showing four of them, again, on the posterior aspect of the thyroid gland. And then there's a summary on this chart, just talking about various aspects of parathyroid hormone. So parathyroid hormone is secreted to promote an increase in blood calcium levels. Therefore, when blood calcium levels are low, you're going to see release of this parathyroid hormone. And its job is to increase the amount of calcium that's available in our blood. So the stimulus for secretion is a decrease in blood calcium levels. And parathyroid gland cells are able to sense the amount of calcium in the blood. They do this through a G protein coupled system, and then we release parathyroid hormone from the parathyroid glands. This is all regulated by negative feedback. So when there's adequate amounts of calcium within the blood, so when there's an increase in calcium in the blood, that will have a negative feedback effect on the parathyroid glands, and then they'll stop releasing parathyroid hormone. In order to increase our blood calcium levels, we essentially do this in three ways. So one of the main mechanisms for increasing blood calcium levels is to affect osteoclastic activity. Now, osteoclasts don't have parathyroid hormone receptors. Actually, as you can see in this diagram, your parathyroid hormone receptors are actually found on osteoblastic cells. So osteoblastic cells are actually the cells that create bone matrix. So they're actually growing bone. Osteoclastic cells are the cells that digest bone. So if you're going to increase, right, if we're going to increase the amount of calcium that's in our blood, we actually need to break down bone. So that would involve osteoclastic activity. So in order for parathyroid hormone to affect osteoclasts, it first has to interact with osteoblastic cells. So parathyroid hormone is binding to receptors that are found on the osteoblastic cells. And the osteoblasts then are releasing cytokine chemicals, paracrine signals, in order to affect the osteoclastic activity. The two main types of chemicals are osteoprotogerin and RANKL or RANKL. These are paracrine signals that will essentially allow for osteoclastic cells to become activated. So here you can see RANKL interacting with, there's the RANKL interacting with the osteoprotogerin cytokine chemical, these paracrine signals, and those will in turn affect the osteoclastic activity. Osteoclasts are essentially a type of macrophage. So it's a modified macrophage, and it's going to release digestive enzymes, and those digestive enzymes, or essentially this acid secretion from the osteoclastic cells, are going to break down the bone matrix, and that's going to release the calcium into the blood. Another way to increase our blood calcium levels is to work through reabsorption of calcium in our kidneys. So I want to move to this figure here. In order to reabsorb calcium in the kidneys, we need to have the effects of parathyroid hormone. So this particular diagram shows two different mechanisms. This is intestinal absorption, and we'll come back to this in a minute, but intestinal absorption is affected by the hormone vitamin D3, which is also known as calcitriol. But for the renal reabsorption, so getting calcium to move across the cuboidal epithelial cells and get calcium back into our blood, we rely heavily on parathyroid hormone in the kidneys. So parathyroid hormone is enhancing calcium reabsorption across the cuboidal epithelial cells, and we're putting that calcium back into the extracellular fluid, which would be our blood. So we're increasing calcium in the blood by affecting the transport of calcium from the nephron lumen into the cardiovascular system. The other mechanism, the third mechanism, is what I just mentioned, and that's looking at calcitriol. Calcitriol essentially is derived from vitamin D, and I'll show you that pathway in a minute. But calcitriol actually affects intestinal absorption of calcium. So when you have calcium in your digestive system, so your intestinal lumen, we want to move that calcium across the epithelial cells and again increase that calcium in the extracellular fluid, which of course would be our blood. So we're moving calcium from the digestive lumen into the blood and thus increasing the amount of blood calcium that we have. And so these are three mechanisms where parathyroid hormone is involved. Now, you may be asking, how is parathyroid hormone involved with this intestinal absorption? Parathyroid hormone is necessary to produce calcitriol. So parathyroid hormone affects the production, right? So parathyroid hormone affects production, and so it's involved in the production of calcitriol. And I'll go over that mechanism in just a second. So parathyroid hormone affects the production of calcitriol, this vitamin D3, and then that's working to help us absorb more calcium into the blood. So let's talk more about calcitriol. So calcitriol is actually derived, need to go back here. Calcitriol is actually derived from vitamin D. Okay, so where do we get vitamin D from? Well, we actually produce some vitamin D upon exposure to sunlight. So our exposure to sunlight will allow for vitamin D to be produced within our skin, but we also get vitamin D from our diet. So we actually consume vitamin D, milk products, eggs, fish, etc. Some people even supplement vitamin D through various vitamins that they take. So we get vitamin D into our circulatory system. That vitamin D passes through the liver and it goes through processing. And then it further is processed in the kidney. So we're converting vitamin D into various molecules. And if you notice that as those molecules pass through the kidney, that's where parathyroid hormone is involved. So parathyroid hormone is affecting enzymes within the kidney to help us produce the calcitriol molecule. And so the calcitriol molecule is this 1,25 dihydroxycholecalciferol. That's a big name to say. So calcitriol or vitamin D3 are easier terms to use when we're referencing this particular hormone. And so what is this calcitriol doing? It is enhancing our intestinal absorption of calcium. So we're increasing our blood calcium levels. So vitamin D produced in the skin, or we consume vitamin D, we start the conversion through our liver, and then we complete that conversion in our kidney with the help of parathyroid hormone. And then we have the ability to enhance our absorption of calcium into our blood. The third hormone to reference would be calcitonin. Calcitonin is essentially the antagonistic hormone to parathyroid hormone and calcitriol. So if parathyroid hormone and calcitriol are increasing our blood calcium, calcitonin is working to decrease our blood calcium. So calcitonin is released when there are increased levels of blood calcium. So affecting the release would be increased levels of calcium, and we need to bring those calcium levels back down into homeostatic levels. And so we have this calcitonin hormone that is essentially enhancing the deposition of calcium into our bones, or it's increasing the release of calcium through our kidneys. So we're targeting bone and we're targeting kidney cells to either store more calcium, or we're going to excrete calcium and eliminate it from the blood. So we have this calcium balance that's taking place between parathyroid, calcitriol, and calcitonin, so that we have the appropriate homeostatic balance for calcium, because calcium is so important in all those various mechanisms of the musculature, the nervous system, and structural components. Another important endocrine gland to talk about is the pancreas. So the pancreas is oftentimes discussed with the digestive system because it's important in the digestion of carbohydrates and proteins, nucleic acids, lipids. And so we tend to focus on pancreatic functionality with digestion because of the pancreatic enzymes. But it should be noted that the pancreas is also an endocrine gland. And so it's producing hormones that are important to our blood sugar balance. So there are two main types of cells to focus on, beta cells and alpha cells. These are part of the pancreatic islets or islets of Langerhans found in the pancreas. And the alpha cells, they produce the hormone glucagon. And the beta cells produce the hormone insulin. And so we use insulin and glucagon to maintain our blood sugar, our glucose balance in the cardiovascular system. So alpha cells secrete glucagon, and beta cells produce insulin. The glucagon that is produced is actually used to increase our blood glucose levels. So it'll stimulate things like glycogenolysis, which is the breakdown of glycogen. It also has effects on lipids, so lipolysis, and freeing up fatty acids, so that we can use glucose and fatty acids within our cells to produce energy. And then we'll also see that glucagon can stimulate the conversion of fatty acids even into ketones as well. So glucagon is increasing our blood, essentially increasing our blood glucose levels. Insulin is lowering our blood glucose levels. So I have a summary of that for you. So here we have what's going on when there's an increase in glucose or when there's a decrease in glucose within our blood. So alpha cells obviously respond to the decrease in blood glucose. So here we have the alpha cells so that they can produce glucagon, and then we get these varying types of effects. Again, the goal is to increase the amount of glucose in our blood so that our cells can continue to function. The increase in blood glucose is going to trigger the beta cells, and the beta cells release the insulin. Excuse me. And the insulin is going to help us lower our blood glucose levels. And that's going to actually allow glucose to get into cells and use that glucose to produce ATP. A good question to ask yourself, because oftentimes we like to look at mechanisms in physiology. So sometimes a good question to ask is, how do, let's say, beta cells recognize that there's increased glucose within the blood? So sometimes looking at a mechanism can help us further understand how these processes work and how hormones get released. So how does a beta cell actually know to release insulin? So you consume something with a sugary content, you're absorbing those sugars into your blood, and then there's this release of insulin so that you can lower your blood sugar. How do these cells actually respond within the pancreas and actually know what to do? So 2 diagrams here. First off, this is beta cell at rest. So this is what's going on when you're not releasing insulin, so no insulin secretion. And then the other diagram is beta cells actually secreting insulin. So how do you actually exocytose the insulin and put that into the bloodstream so that glucose can be taken out of the blood and put into cells? So how does this beta cell actually know what to do? So here's how the mechanism works. When there's when there's not as much glucose, right? When there's less glucose in your blood, then you're not taking that glucose into the beta cell, so there's less metabolism and less ATP that's taking place. That's important. The decrease in ATP within the beta cell is going to keep these potassium channels open. And these potassium channels allow potassium to leave the beta cell, and it keeps the beta cell at resting membrane potential. So if the beta cell remains at resting membrane potential, then you're not affecting these calcium voltage-gated channels. So the calcium voltage-gated channels stay closed when you're at resting membrane potential. Without calcium, so no calcium coming into the cell, means no exocytosis. Okay, so there's no release of the insulin that's stored in these vesicles. Okay, so less ATP in the beta cell keeps the potassium channels open. You stay at resting membrane potential. You keep the calcium voltage gated channels closed. No exocytosis. So you can see where we're going with this. If there's an increase in glucose, so you've consumed something sugary, you've absorbed that sugar into your blood, if there's more glucose within your blood, then you're also going to be transporting that glucose into the beta cells. So here we have glucose moving into the beta cell. Glucose then can go through glycolysis, it can go through the citric acid cycle, we can have the electron transport chain taking place, and all of that leads to an increased production of ATP. And so this is where we see a change in what's happening within the beta cell. When there's an increase in ATP, it actually closes these potassium channels, these potassium ATP channels. So now the channel's closed. So now you're holding on to more potassium within the cell than you normally would hold on to. And so if you're holding on to more potassium because it can't escape, those positive ions are going to cause a depolarization. And so there's a depolarization of the beta cell because you're holding on to more positive ions than you normally would. That depolarization brings us to the threshold value for these calcium voltage gated channels. And so these calcium voltage gated channels are allowed to open because of the depolarization. Calcium then enters into the beta cell, and calcium is a trigger for exocytosis. So calcium now can bind to the necessary sensor proteins and lead to the active transport mechanism that we know as exocytosis. And so what we get is an exocytosis of insulin. So we're releasing insulin hormone, okay, into the blood. And now insulin can go and bind to receptors out on body cells and communicate with our body cells that there's an increase in glucose in the blood, and those body cells should then be taking that glucose into the cell to then convert into their own ATP to perform their cellular functions. So that is how a beta cell can recognize that insulin needs to actually be released. Another gland to take a look at that's interesting is the pineal gland. The pineal gland is important for its secretion of the melatonin hormone. And so melatonin is a hormone that actually helps regulate our light and dark cycles, okay? So that we essentially have the ability to be sleepy when it gets dark and awake during the daytime. So melatonin is tied to this essentially retinal pathway. So we have this retinohypothalamic pathway where we have light information that transfers through our hypothalamus. So here's the hypothalamus. So we have light information that's traveling through the hypothalamus, and then we're tying that information to the pineal gland. So we are controlling the secretion of melatonin essentially based on light and dark cycles. So when there's more light information coming through the pathway, then we're going to inhibit this pathway. Okay, so when there's more light, there's an inhibition of this essentially biological clock pathway, and you're going to have less melatonin secretion, and thus you're going to stay awake. When there's less light, then this pathway is stimulated. We release melatonin, and it begins to make us sleepy. Okay? And so we want to fall asleep at night. So if we look at a graphical representation of this, you'll notice that melatonin levels are low throughout the day when you have more light stimulating this pathway. So the light is essentially an inhibitory signal, if you will, to not secrete melatonin. But as it gets darker, you'll notice that your melatonin levels increase. Okay? And melatonin is going to make you sleepy. So as you reach the 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, 12 p.m. Time frame, you're going to be getting sleepier. And so then you fall asleep at night and you go through your sleep pattern. So melatonin is affecting your ability to sleep. Some people do suffer from insomnia. And so that's a condition where you can't sleep at night. And so there are some over-the-counter melatonin supplements that you can use to help you fall asleep. I would caution against sleep aids if at all possible, only because once you become dependent upon a sleep aid, it's very difficult to get off of that sleep aid and actually sleep naturally. So again, from this chart, you can see during the day, melatonin levels stay low, and then in the nighttime and while you're sleeping, they are higher. Notice, though, that they begin to drop off. Melatonin levels are dropping as you approach the morning, and that's how you know to wake up in the morning. A lot of people have a sleep pattern where they don't even use alarms, right? You know when to go to sleep at night and you know when to wake up in the morning, and it's all being regulated by this melatonin hormone. You may also notice that this is a hormone that's derived from tryptophan. So we use the amino acid tryptophan to produce melatonin. This is why many associate turkey or milk, things like that, with getting sleepy. And that's because those products have tryptophan in them, and it's going to help you to naturally produce the appropriate melatonin levels you need to fall asleep at night. The last gland to take a look at would be the thymus gland. The thymus gland, if you notice, is located inferior to your thyroid gland, and then it's located superior to your heart. So it's essentially sitting right above the heart. The thymus gland is important because it's a site of T cell maturation. So our thymus is where we get mature T cells from. And T cells are part of the immune system. They are a type of lymphocyte, and they are used in fighting virus-infected cells. They're used in fighting cancer cells. They are used in essentially foreign rejection. So even in transplant rejection, graft rejection, you're going to see T cell type activity. So these lymphocytes are essentially involved in what we call cell-mediated immunity. They're able to go after cells and destroy cells. So how is the thymus involved? Well, the thymus produces hormones that allow for T cell maturation. So the thymus is producing what we call thymosin or thymopoietin, and these are chemicals that are involved in the process of T cell maturation. What's interesting is this particular gland gets smaller as you get older. So it's most active in childhood, but it begins to regress once you go through puberty. And as you continue to grow as an adult, we see less and less activity of the thymus gland. So there's a little bit on some other endocrine organs and the hormones that they produce. I hope that helps. Take care.